Laughter echoed through the crystal ballroom as the elite awaited the ultimate humiliation. A notorious syndicate boss was supposed to publicly reject the overweight heiress pushed into his arms. Instead, dead silence fell when a singular chilling promise slipped past his lips, rewriting the rules of the underworld forever. In our world, respect is currency, and humiliation is a death sentence. My name is Gabriel Costa. By the age of 32, I had buried my father, consolidated the 5 warring factions of the New York Syndicate, and taken absolute control of the Eastern Seaboard's underground logistics. But having power and keeping it are 2 entirely different beasts. To keep it, I needed access to the Newark shipping ports, and the Newark ports were tightly controlled by a single unbribable ghost of a man, Commissioner Richard Montgomery. Montgomery wasn't mob. He was old money deeply entrenched in state politics and notoriously paranoid. He had only one weakness, his only child, his daughter Clara. For months, my underbosses had been trying to find an angle away into Montgomery's inner circle. That was when Tristan Hughes and Lorenzo Bianchi stepped in. Tristan and Lorenzo were heirs to the old-school Italian and Irish syndicates men who smiled in my face at sit-downs while actively plotting to carve up my territory. They were relics boys playing dress-up in their father's suits, but they had political connections I lacked. "We have a gift for you, Gabriel." Tristan had purred over a glass of Macallan at the Onyx Room a week prior. An introduction. Commissioner Montgomery is bringing his daughter to the Winter Gala at the Waldorf Astoria. We've arranged for you to be seated at their private table. Charm, the daughter and the father, hands you the keys to the kingdom. It sounded too easy. I knew it was a setup. I just didn't know what the trap was. When I arrived at the Waldorf Astoria on the night of the gala, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and underlying malice. The room was a sea of custom tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. I navigated the floor, shaking hands with senators, and made men alike my eyes, scanning for Montgomery. I found Tristan and Lorenzo waiting by table 1. They looked like cats who had swallowed the canary, barely containing their smug grins. "Gabriel," Lorenzo said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Allow us to introduce you to your future bride, Clara Montgomery." He stepped aside. The trap sprang shut, and the sheer cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Clara Montgomery was not the typical high society heiress. In a room full of starved, surgically enhanced socialites, Clara stood out like a target painted in neon. She was fat. There is no polite, euphemistic way to describe the reality of what the room saw, and there was no hiding it under the sprawling layers of her dark emerald marchesa gown. She was heavily overweight, thick arms, a wide waist, and a soft, round face that was flushed deep red with sheer agonizing embarrassment. She stood beside her father, clutching a sequined evening bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She was sweating slightly under the heat of the massive crystal chandeliers, visibly struggling to breathe through what I could only imagine was a crippling wave of social anxiety. The silence around our table was deafening, followed immediately by the rapid, venomous buzzing of whispers. Tristan and Lorenzo hadn't just set me up. They had engineered a public spectacle designed to destroy me. In their minds, they had backed me into an impossible corner. If I played the gentleman and courted the fat girl, my ruthless reputation would be shattered. I would become the laughingstock of the 5 families, seen as a desperate, weak man who would stoop to anything for a shipping lane. Blood in the water. But if I reacted the way they expected me to, if I scoffed, turned my back, or insulted her to save my pride, Richard Montgomery would witness the public humiliation of his beloved daughter. He would lock down the ports forever, strangling my empire's cash flow and inciting a mutiny among my capos. It was a brilliant, vicious checkmate. I looked at Tristan. His eyes were dancing with malicious glee. He was waiting for the eruption. He was waiting for the famous Costa temper to flare up and burn my own empire to the ground. Then I looked back at Clara. Most people in her position would be looking at the floor, praying for the ground to swallow them whole. But as my eyes met hers, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. She wasn't looking down. She was looking right at me. Behind the flushed cheeks and the trembling hands was a pair of sharp, highly intelligent dark brown eyes. She knew. She knew exactly what this was, what Tristan had done, and she knew she was being used as a prop in a game of monsters. The profound sadness in her gaze wasn't for herself. It was a silent, resigned acceptance of the cruelty of the world. She didn't pity herself. She endured it. In that fleeting second, I saw more strength in this trembling, heavy-set woman than I had ever seen in the hardened killers that surrounded me. Miss Montgomery. I said, my voice cutting through the whispers like a serrated blade. I stepped forward, bypassing Tristan entirely, and extended my hand. Gabriel Costa. It is an absolute honor. Clara hesitated. A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Slowly she unclasped one hand from her bag and placed it in mine. Her skin was soft, but her grip was surprisingly firm. Mr. Costa, she replied quietly. Her voice was steady, despite the tremor in her fingers. The honor is mine. I pulled out a chair for her, a custom-reinforced seat that Tristan had undoubtedly arranged just to highlight her size. I sat directly beside her, ignoring the incredulous stares of the men who had planned my downfall. The game was on, but I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Every course brought a new, thinly veiled insult from across the table. Tristan and Lorenzo, emboldened by their own perceived cleverness, began to push the boundaries of their joke. So Gabriel, Tristan said loudly, as the waiters cleared the appetizer plates, ensuring his voice carried to the neighboring tables. I understand you're looking to expand your operations. Taking on a lot of heavy cargo, I hear. It requires a man with a very broad capacity to handle such massive burdens. Lorenzo snickered into his wine glass. Across the room, a few prominent mob wives hid their smiles behind crystal flutes of champagne. Beside me, Clara flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but I felt the shift in the air. She carefully folded her napkin and placed it on her lap, her eyes fixed perfectly on the center of her empty plate. My daughter handles the logistics for the family trust, Commissioner Montgomery said, gruffly, oblivious to the double meanings, though his eyes darted nervously around the table. She's brilliant with numbers. Oh, I have no doubt Clara knows her way around large figures. Lorenzo chimed in, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. My jaw locked. Underneath the table, my hand balled into a fist so tight my knuckles ached. I had murdered men for far less than a sideways glance. Yet here were two silver spoon cowards, openly mocking a woman simply for existing all to get at me. I leaned closer to Clara. "Ignore them," I murmured, keeping my voice so low only she could hear. "They are dead men walking." She didn't look at me, but she whispered back, her voice barely a breath. "You don't have to defend me, Mr. Costa. I know why I'm here. I know I'm the joke. Just endure it, get the port deal from my father, and you never have to look at me again." The resignation in her voice hit me harder than a bullet. She had spent her entire life being the punchline written off and discarded because she didn't fit into a sample-sized dress. She had accepted her role as collateral damage in the games of powerful men. Not today, I thought. Not in my presence. The main course arrived. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Everyone was watching our table, waiting for the inevitable moment when I would snap and reject her. They wanted to see the Costa air break. Tristan stood up, tapping his silver fork against his champagne flute. Clink, clink, clink. The ballroom fell completely silent. The orchestra ceased playing. Hundreds of eyes turned toward table 1. Ladies and gentlemen, Tristan projected his voice, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I'd like to propose a toast to Gabriel Costa, a man who has always taken whatever is placed in front of him. A man who isn't afraid to take on the biggest challenges in the room. More muffled laughter. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear betrayed her slipping down her cheek, catching the light of the chandeliers. We wish you and your beautiful new prospect the best of luck. Tristan finished, raising his glass directly at me. May your union be as substantial as she is. Open laughter erupted from the Bianchi and Hughes tables. It was time. I didn't rush. I slowly reached into my jacket, withdrew a monogrammed silk handkerchief, and gently wiped the tear from Clara's cheek. The tenderness of the action sent a shockwave of confusion through the immediate vicinity. The laughter began to falter. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the wood against the marble floor sounded like a gunshot. I stood to my full height, towering over the table. I didn't look at Montgomery. I didn't look at the crowd. I locked my eyes dead onto Tristan Hughes. The smirk slowly melted off Tristan's face as he realized I wasn't blushing. I wasn't embarrassed. I was radiating a cold, localized violence that froze the air in the room. Behind me, I heard the subtle rustle of fabric as 40 Costa soldiers, strategically stationed around the ballroom, simultaneously stepped forward, slipping their hands inside their jackets. The room went deathly still. You could hear a pin drop. I reached down and took Clara's hand, pulling her gently to her feet. She looked up at me, terrified, bewildered. I pulled her to my side, wrapping my arms securely around her waist, claiming her in front of the entire Eastern underworld. I looked back at Tristan, my voice dropping to a terrifying, echoing calm. She is mine. Your families are finished. 7 words. 7 words that shattered the carefully constructed hierarchy of the New York underworld. For 2 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Tristan's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen white. He opened his mouth to speak, to play it off as a joke, but the words died in his throat. Lorenzo took a physical step backward, bumping into a waiter. Gabriel. Tristan stammered, the bravado entirely gone. It was just a jest. Leave, I commanded, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuse. Before I turn this ballroom into an abattoir. Panic erupted. The Bianchi and Hughes capos scrambled, practically tripping over themselves to get their bosses out of the room. Chairs were knocked over, glasses shattered. The high society elite who had been laughing seconds ago were now huddled in terror, realizing that they had just witnessed a declaration of total war. I turned to Commissioner Montgomery, who was staring at me in absolute, unadulterated shock. Commissioner, I said smoothly, as if I hadn't just ordered the execution of 2 crime families. If you will excuse us, Clara and I are leaving. We have much to discuss. I didn't wait for his permission. I kept my arm around Clara and guided her toward the main exit. The sea of people parted for us like the Red Sea averting their eyes, terrified to even look at the woman they had been openly mocking minutes prior. As we stepped out into the freezing New York night, the valet rushed forward with my armored SUV. I opened the door for Clara. She stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind whipping her hair, looking at me as if I were an alien. "Why?" She finally choked out her chest, heaving. "Why did you do that? You just started a war. Over a joke. Over me." I stepped closer to her, blocking the biting wind. I looked at the woman who had braced herself against the cruelty of the world, and I saw my future. They thought they were giving me a heavy burden to sink my empire. I told her, my eyes tracing the beautiful, stunned features of her face. They didn't realize they were giving me my anchor. I helped her into the car. The trap had been sprung all right, but it wasn't my grave they had dug. It was theirs. The fallout from the Waldorf Astoria gala was immediate, bloody, and entirely unprecedented. By the time the sun rose over the frozen Manhattan skyline, the fragile truce governing the Eastern syndicates had completely evaporated. Gabriel Costa had drawn a line in the marble floor, and the Hughes and Bianchi families had no choice but to cross it. The vicious whispers that had mocked Clara Montgomery's heavy frame hours earlier were rapidly replaced by the deafening roar of automatic weapons, shattered glass, and burning shipping containers along the Brooklyn waterfront. Not since John Gotti orchestrated the brazen assassination of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in the winter of 1985 had the